for today's movie review, I'll be reviewing Bumblebee, a movie that I originally had no intention of seeing, because if you went back to my review of Transformers The Last Knight, I said something along the lines of being done with the live-action Transformers franchise to a point that if they continued to make sequels or spin-off movies, I would not go and see them, and that Paramount Pictures should stop making Transformers movies and reboot the franchise 10 years later after Last Knight, featuring new blood essentially. But as production for the movie continued, it was revealed that the movie was going to be directed by Travis Knight, the same director who created the 2015 or 2016 fantasy animated movie Kubo and the Two Strings. And through a combination of learning about the director of the movie and seeing the first trailer, it definitely grabbed my attention. But I put the movie in the same vein as something like the 2016 Ghostbusters movie, where on one hand, I will see the movie eventually just on home video as opposed to seeing it in the theater. And to add on top of that, even if I did want to see this movie in theaters, it literally came out the same day as Aquaman, and I had more interest in seeing Aquaman over Bumblebee. But sure enough, around the release of the movie, it got generally positive reception to a point that a lot of people, ranging from movie critics to casual moviegoers, stated that this was the best Transformers movie to date. And because of this, I decided to break my vow of silence and went to see Bumblebee in theaters. Which begs the question, is Bumblebee the best live-action Transformers movie to date? As for the plot of the movie, it's about this young woman who's on the verge of entering adulthood, who's trying to find her place in the world. And on her 18th birthday, she ends up buying a yellow Volkswagen Beetle, only to discover that the car she bought is really a giant alien robot that came from the planet Cybertron, who is a part of a legion of giant robots known as the Autobots, who are currently at war with another legion of giant robots known as the Decepticons. As the young woman forms an unusual friendship with the Autobot, now dubbed Bumblebee, a pair of Decepticons soon learn of Bumblebee's location and make their way towards Earth in hopes to conquer it. In terms of what I liked about the movie, Bumblebee is the first honest-to-God live-action Transformers movie to have a story that is simple to follow. Now, what do I mean by this? In the last few installments of the Michael Bay Transformer movies, especially between Age of Extinction and Last Knight, there is so much going on that Paramount Pictures could have made 4 to 8 different movies set within the Transformers franchise. However, they didn't go that route. They decided to take 4 to 8 movies worth of ideas and shove it down to 2 different movies. For example, with Transformers The Last Knight, there are at least 5 different plot lines going on at the same time. The first plot line is revolved around Cade Yeager and the remaining Autobots, who are being hunted down by the human forces because of the events of the past 2 Transformer movies. You have the second plot line revolved around Optimus Prime turning evil because of Quintessa, who wants to use Optimus Prime to destroy Earth and restore Cybertron back to its glory days. As for the third plot line, it's revolved around Megatron trying to reform the Decepticons in order to hunt down the remaining Autobots. Then you have the fourth plot line that's revolved around Bumblebee and Anthony Hopkins' character fighting Nazis during World War II. As for the fifth and final plotline to the movie, it revolves around a woman who discovers that she is a modern-day relative of Merlin from the Legend of King Arthur, and she has to get her hands on Merlin's staff in order to save the world from Unicron. And this serves as the primary driving force of the movie that connects all the other plotlines together to form this incoherent narrative that is Transformers The Last Knight. As for this movie, the overall narrative to Bumblebee is both coherent and simple enough that you can actually understand what's going on. Because if I had to describe this movie in a nutshell, it's basically a live-action remake of The Iron Giant, just add a few more robots, and that's basically Bumblebee in a nutshell. And between those two descriptions, Bumblebee's narrative is so simple that you can literally understand what occurs within the narrative. With Transformers The Last Knight, the narrative has so much going on that it makes it hard to understand what occurs within the story. Another thing I liked about the movie is the combination of the CGI and the robot designs for the movie, because on one hand, this movie has really good CGI effects for the Transformers themselves. Like, this is probably the best looking CGI in the entire Transformer franchise. In regards to the amount of detail that goes into each of the Transformers featured in this movie, because when you really do look at the Transformers themselves, they definitely have a lot of detail added to them, but nowhere near as much detail as you would see in the later Michael Bay Transformer movies, where those Transformers have so much detail added to them that their designs basically blur together, and it's hard to tell each one apart in some cases. And as far as the actual physical designs of the Transformers themselves go, they're not as bad as I thought they were gonna be, because if I had to be honest, I never really grew up with the G1 Transformers, and although I do recognize a lot of their designs, I never really thought that those designs would translate well onto the big screen. Because anytime you try to make a live action movie based on a cartoon or a comic book character, you want to design a character in a way where, as a live action version of the character, they're very recognizable and resemble their comic book or cartoon counterpart, but you want to do your own thing with it. For example, with Optimus Prime that was featured in the original Michael Bay Transformers movie. Looks nothing like the one from the G1 cartoon, but there's enough visual motifs from the red and blue color scheme, the truck mode, along with the head design that you can literally sit there and go, okay, this isn't the one from the cartoon, but this is definitely Optimus Prime. With this movie, on the other hand, the filmmakers literally took all the G1 Transformer designs, added a third dimension to them, and you literally get all the Transformer designs from the G1 cartoon. And I was really surprised by how good they looked. Now sure, I didn't necessarily think that the designs for the Transformers in this movie needed to look exactly like their G1 counterparts, but I think in comparison to something like the Michael Bay Transformer designs, where they looked so different from their G1 counterparts that they might as well have been their own character, with the exception of Blitzwing in this movie, which I'll get to later. But for the most part, the actual designs to the Transformers themselves looked a lot better in live action format than I was expecting it to be. Although, I think out of all the Transformers that appear in this movie, Bumblebee himself has hands down the best design. Because as I said earlier, when you look at all the other Autobots and Decepticons that appear in that opening action sequence, it's literally the G1 incarnation in a third dimension. And when you look at all the Autobots and Decepticons that appear in the Michael Bay Transformer movies, sure, there might be a handful that resemble their G1 counterparts, but design-wise, look nothing like their G1 counterparts. Bumblebee is this happy medium between the two, where he definitely has enough visual aesthetics carried over from the Michael Bay movies, but you can also tell that some parts of his body were based off that of his G1 counterpart, making his design a happy union between the G1 and Bay former designs. And I think that they should have applied this type of logic to all the other Transformers as well. Another aspect of the movie that I liked is the fact that the Transformers use their vehicle modes to their advantage. For example, sometime during the climax of the film where you have Bumblebee battling Dropkick. Dropkick grabs Bumblebee, tosses him several yards, but right before Bumblebee hits the ground, he transforms into his vehicle mode at the last second, hits the ground, drives off for a little bit, turns around, then speeds up, and right before he has a chance to hit Dropkick in his vehicle mode, at the last second, Bumblebee transforms back into his robot mode, using the combination of speed and momentum from his vehicle mode to propel himself in order to tackle Dropkick. And the Transformers themselves do this multiple times throughout the movie, which is really refreshing to see, because the Transformers in the Michael Bay movies barely used their vehicle modes to their advantage. Or when they did, it was once in a great while. Also, speaking of the fight scenes, I actually like the fight choreography in this movie, in that sense where not only do you get an idea of what's actually going on within frame, but I actually like the moves that some of the characters utilize against one another. For example, there are several points in time where you see Bumblebee using his opponent's size and weight to his advantage, which is something that you would do in a martial arts fighting style like Judo. And upon seeing Bumblebee using judo flips, this says a lot about both Bumblebee as a character along with the filmmakers, because on one hand, this shows that despite Bumblebee being one of the smaller Transformers, he can definitely hold his own against any Decepticon, no matter how big they are. As for the filmmakers, on the other hand, the fact that you see the Transformers themselves using martial arts styles ranging from judo, scissor kick, along with taekwondo, tells me that the filmmakers were using real-life combat tactics during these fight scenes to make them more fluent. And even when you do see the robots simply punching each other, you can really feel the weight of their punches, because the Transformers themselves actually have a sense of mass to them, whereas the Transformers in the Michael Bay movies, despite them being large, didn't have that sense of mass that the Transformers in this movie have. I also like the fact that the Transformers themselves also use their environment to their advantage, regardless if it's using a boat as a shield or grabbing a steel beam to whack another Transformer. It really shows how flexible a fighter Bumblebee along with the other Transformers can be when put into the right situation. Another aspect of the movie that I liked is the parallel that Charlie and Bumblebee have in common, which is, in some shape or form, both their worlds have changed. For example, with Charlie, her world's completely different on an emotional level because at some point in her life, she lost her father, and her mother and younger brother have seamlessly moved on and are currently enjoying the company of the mother's new boyfriend. And upon seeing that her mother and younger brother enjoy the company of the mother's new boyfriend, Charlie decides to withdraw herself from her family because she decides that she wants nothing to do with that world. As for Bumblebee, his world has literally changed in that sense where he has to leave his home world of Cybertron and crash lands on Earth, and as soon as he arrives on Earth, he gets into a battle with the Decepticon Blitzwing, and as a result, he becomes damaged, both physically and mentally speaking. Now, put these two together, and they have a very interesting relationship because you have these two characters who are damaged in some shape or form. With Charlie, she's damaged emotionally, whereas Bumblebee is damaged both physically and mentally speaking. And in a endearing way, they both help each other out, where you have Charlie, who's this grease monkey that physically repairs Bumblebee and tries to help him regain his memory while teaching him about the local customs of planet Earth, while Bumblebee helps Charlie out in an emotional sense, both intentionally and unintentionally, where we either see Bumblebee encouraging Charlie to take part in a social gathering, or Bumblebee finds an object that's related to Charlie's father, and this gets her angry at first, but then she begins to open up her feelings about what she's emotionally going through with her father not being in her life anymore, and actually feels comfortable talking about her emotions with Bumblebee as opposed to her mother, who tries to make Charlie open up about her feelings but fails at it. And while staying on topic with the lead two characters, the relationship between Charlie and Bumblebee is the heart of the movie, since the movie is a lot more character driven as opposed to plot or action driven, which is really refreshing to see in a movie like this, especially in comparison to the other Michael Bay Transformer movies. As for the acting in the movie, with the exception of Haley Steinfeld's Charlie and John Cena's Jack Burns, I think all of the other actors and actresses give pretty standard performances that are required for the characters that they play. Granted, I think that they play their parts fine, but could have been better. And as for the top billed actors of Haley Steinfeld and John Cena's performance I really enjoyed for more ironic reasons than anything else, because John Cena gives a really hammy performance while playing the character of Jack Burns, but at the same time I think John Cena's hammy performance works well for his character, since his character of Jack Burns is a colonel within the Sector 7 agency, so he has to have a certain level of authority in order to lead his troops into hunting down Bumblebee. Then you have Haley Steinfeld, who plays the role of Charlie Watson, who perhaps gives the best performance not just within this movie, but within the live-action Transformers franchise in general, because her performance as Charlie Watson is really astounding to a point that her performance alone is what's carrying the movie, along with her interactions with Bumblebee. I also found her character of Charlie Watson to be a very likable protagonist, in that sense where you have this withdrawn grease monkey that's broken down, emotionally speaking, who not only seeks freedom from the current life that she's living in, but she also seeks purpose in terms of what she really wants to do with her life. And I find that really refreshing for a movie character. In terms of what I dislike about the movie, Bumblebee is really confused in terms of where it's going with the franchise, because when you look at the advertising for the movie, Bumblebee is being advertised as a prequel to the first Michael Bay Transformers movie. And for the first half of this movie, that does appear to be the case. Because this movie does address how Bumblebee lost his voice. The Sector 7 organization appears in this movie, along with the Hoover Dam base, which were either mentioned or featured in the first Transformers movie. But as the movie progresses, it stops being a prequel and then becomes a soft reboot. Now, why do I think this? Well, this leads into another problem that I have with the movie, the continuity. Because if Bumblebee is really a prequel to the first Michael Bay Transformers movie, continuity doesn't line up. Because in Transformers The Last Knight, it's established that both Bumblebee and Hot Rod land on Earth sometime around World War II and help the Americans fight the Nazis. In this movie, Bumblebee lands on Earth by himself during the 1980s. Another example of this movie being confused as to whether or not it's trying to be a prequel or reboot occurs in the opening action sequence, because Optimus Prime tells Bumblebee to head to Earth. Now, if this was a prequel, having Bumblebee going to Earth would make a lot of sense, because the Autobots and Decepticons are looking for the Allspark. However, Optimus sends Bumblebee to Earth for a completely different reason. That reason being to establish a Autobot base of operations. And the problem that I have with this scene is, if this movie was indeed a prequel to the 2007 Transformers movie, the Autobots knowing about Earth would make a lot more sense, because the Allspark is on Earth. However, with this movie being a reboot, how do the Autobots know about Earth, and why would they go to Earth? It just doesn't add up. So yeah, there are some inconsistencies with this timeline. Granted, the timeline presented in the Michael Bay Transformer movies made less and less sense the more installments he made, so I shouldn't be all that surprised by the continuity errors that this movie presents within that timeline. And that's if this movie still counts as a prequel and not a reboot. Also, the humor I didn't think was very good. I mean, sure, there might have been a scene here and there that might have gotten a giggle out of me, but I didn't think the humor was all that great. But at least it was a step up from the cringe humor that we saw in the other Michael Bay Transformer movies. Another problem that I have revolves around the cliche of the bully character archetype for a couple reasons. One, it's the bully character archetype. Second, the movie does nothing new with this archetype. And three, it doesn't really contribute anything to the overarching story. Like, you could have taken this character out of the movie and the movie would still functioned fine, as it were. Or if you're going to include this character archetype, do something new with it. Personally, this is what I would have done. Maybe at some point in the movie, the bully gets killed by one of the two Decepticons, and have the main character go through an emotional struggle where on one hand, she didn't like the bully, but not to a point where she wanted to see this character die. And then come to the conclusion that if people around me are getting killed by these two Decepticons, maybe I should rethink about my relationship with Bumblebee. That could have been interesting. But no, we get the bully archetype that just goes nowhere. Another problem that I have with the movie revolves around the two Decepticons that act as the primary villains of the movie. Because on one hand, I understand that you don't want to feature well-known Decepticons like Megatron, Starscream, Shockwave, or Soundwave as the main villain for this type of movie, but I feel like the villains that they used for this movie could have been a lot better. Because as it sits, the two primary villains of this movie are Shatter and Dropkick. And sure, they're both made up for the movie, which is really cool, but don't you think it would have been cool if maybe instead of featuring Shatter and Dropkick as the two main villains, the filmmakers could have instead featured Decepticons like Blitzwing and Barricade, or Black Arachnia and Knockout as the two primary villains, instead of the two Decepticons that we got? And speaking of Blitzwing, another problem that I have with the movie is the overall design aesthetic to Blitzwing himself. Because back when the first teaser trailer for this movie came out, there was a point in time where we get a first glimpse of one of the Decepticons in the movie. And a lot of people, myself included, speculated that Starscream was going to be the main villain of this movie, because the Decepticon that appears in that teaser trailer looked a lot like Starscream from the G1 cartoon. But as time progressed, It was soon revealed that the Decepticon that appeared in that teaser was not Starscream, but Blitzwing, since the director claimed that Blitzwing's design was meant to serve as an homage to Starscream, which makes no sense, because at the very beginning of this movie, Starscream makes a non-speaking cameo, and he looks like his G1 counterpart. So really, making Blitzwing's design serve as an homage to the G1 Starscream is just redundant because Starscream appears in the movie. It also doesn't help the fact that Blitzwing has his own unique design that's really different from Starscream, because in the G1 continuity, Blitzwing was purple and beige in appearance and also had tank-like characteristics, since Blitzwing was a triple changer where he could transform into both a jet and a tank. So why they didn't go in that direction with the movie version of Blitzwing is beyond me. Another problem that I have with the movie revolves around the Decepticons in regards to obtaining information while interrogating Bumblebee or any other Autobot. Because when you see these Decepticons interrogating Bumblebee or some other Autobot, they sit there and they're trying to get information out of these characters, and it gets to a point where either Bumblebee or a random Autobot straight up refuses to tell them, and instead of torturing them to get the information out of them, they just straight up either rip their vocal cords out or kill them altogether. It's just like, I don't think you did your job of obtaining information, because if your purpose was to get information out of the Autobots, yet you straight up get rid of their vocal cords or kill them, you're not getting that information. Another problem that I had with the movie revolves around the pacing for the middle of the movie. Because in the first third, the movie just kicks off with action sequence after action sequence after action sequence and a couple other events. And the pacing is really quick. However, sometime after Charlie and Bumblebee become friends with one another, I feel like the pacing to the movie drags a bit. Because in the middle of the movie, nothing really happens. Or if something does happen, it's just Charlie, Bumblebee, and Memo pulling pranks on the bully character. And that's it. Or Bumblebee causing shenanigans. Another problem I have with the movie revolves around a plot hole that occurs in the middle of the movie, because there's a point in time where the main character's mother has to bring their dog to the vet, and she decides to drive the Volkswagen, not knowing that it's really Bumblebee in disguise. And then this chase occurs with the main character riding a moped, catching up to the mother while she's still driving Bumblebee. And what transpires next doesn't really add up, because sometime after that little scene, we have both Charlie and Bumblebee at the beach. And my question is, what happened to the dog and the moped? Like, the movie literally goes from Charlie talking to her mother inside of Bumblebee to Charlie and Bumblebee at the beach. Like, we don't see what happens in between. Like, did the mother take the moped back home to allow Charlie to drive Bumblebee to the vet to drop the dog off? Or did Charlie bring the dog to the beach with both her and Bumblebee? But that can't be the case because the dog was never at the beach, so yeah, we don't know what happened to neither the dog or moped in that particular sequence. And yeah, there's a few more plot holes that are like that, but I think that was the one that bugged me the most. Then there are several moments in time where stupid stuff occurs in order to move the story forward. For example, at the very start of the movie, when Bumblebee lands on Earth, he just so happens to land in the same exact area as John Cena's character. And at that exact moment, there was essentially like a moment of silence in which Bumblebee could have explained his situation to John Cena's character, but he didn't, because an action scene occurs, and by the time that action scene concludes, Bumblebee attempts to talk to John Cena's character about a situation, only for another action sequence to occur, not giving Bumblebee the proper amount of time to talk to John Cena's character. Another stupid moment that comes to mind revolves around the two Decepticons, because within the movie, both Shatter and Dropkick are triple changers, where they have two vehicle modes, one of them being a car mode and the other one being a aircraft of sorts. And there's this one moment where both Decepticons are in their aircraft modes, then they transform into their car modes for like 2 seconds, only to transform into their robot modes. And my question is, why bother transforming from the aircraft mode to the car mode to the robot mode when you could have just transformed from the aircraft mode to the robot form? It just seemed kinda redundant. And for my last problem with the movie revolves around the overall plot structure to the movie itself. Because the actual story itself isn't bad, it's just way too familiar, since the movie is going for the quintessential a boy and his non-human friend type story, like you would see in something like E.T. or The Iron Giant, which isn't a bad thing. It's just one of those things where as soon as Bumblebee lands on Earth, you can literally predict every single plot point in order of appearance from the start of the movie up to the end, which makes the movie predictable. Not bad, but predictable. So, for my final verdict of Bumblebee, have you or heard someone ask the question, what would a live-action Transformers movie look and sound like if it wasn't directed by Michael Bay? Well, if I had to answer that question, it would literally take the form of this movie, because by all accounts, Bumblebee is a lot better than I originally thought it was going to be. Because with the later Michael Bay Transformer movies, they often had stories that were hard to follow, retreaded plot points from the first movie, had poorly written characters, and barely featured the Transformers themselves. With Bumblebee, on the other hand, the story is simple to follow, it does its own thing, the characters are written in a way that you can understand them, and despite not having a very large cast of Transformers to follow, the few that we do get to know have equal amounts of screen time. Now sure, the movie does suffer from some tropes that you typically associate with this type of story, and there are several other problems that I have with the movie, along with having a better set of villains instead of the ones we got, but the ones that appear in this movie make sense within the context of the story. But I still had a good time watching Bumblebee. So overall, Bumblebee, as a movie by itself, I found to be a nice little pleasant surprise, and as an installment within the live-action Transformers franchise, it's the best live-action Transformers movie since the original, and on top of that, this is probably the closest thing you're ever gonna get to seeing a live-action remake of The Iron Giant. And before I give my final rating, what did everyone else have to say about Bumblebee? So it looks like the movie got generally average to positive reception, making it the best movie within the franchise, which isn't really saying much considering the fact that the other movies were directed by Michael Bay. But anywho, for my final rating of Bumblebee, I give it a 4 out of 5. So, do you think people respond to this movie well because the movie's just that good, or is it because Michael Bay wasn't directing it? And see you later.